April 18th, 1943, so 9:34 hours. The sky above Bougainville, the air at 20,000 feet was thin and cold, and in the cockpit of his P-38 Lightning, Captain Thomas Lanphier could feel the vibration of twin Allison engines through his gloves, through his bones, through the aluminum skin that separated him from empty space. Below him, the Solomon Sea stretched in every direction, endless, indifferent, the same blue that had swallowed so many men without ceremony or memory. He had been flying for more than 2 hours, following a course plotted to the minute, calculated to the mile, based on information that seemed too precise to be real. At 09:35, exactly on schedule, he saw them, 2 Japanese bombers, twin-engine Mitsubishi G4Ms, flying low over the jungle canopy, flanked by 6 Zero fighters. They were heading northwest toward Balali Airfield, moving with the casual confidence of men who believed themselves safe. The bombers were so low that Lanphier could see their shadows racing across the treetops, dark shapes flickering over green. He pushed the throttle forward and dove. In the lead bomber, a man sat in the passenger compartment, reviewing papers, perhaps thinking about the inspection tour he was about to conduct. He was 60 years old, his hair grey, his face lined with the weight of command and the knowledge of what he had set in motion. His name was Isoroku Yamamoto, Admiral of the Combined Fleet, architect of Pearl Harbor, the man who had promised his emperor that Japan could hold the Pacific for 6 months, maybe a year, before American industrial power crushed them. It had been 17 months since Pearl Harbor. Yamamoto's promise had expired, and now, because of a message decoded in a basement in Washington, because of mathematics and cryptography and the relentless efficiency of American intelligence, he was about to pay a debt written in the smoke of burning ships and the blood of sailors who never had a chance to fight back. This is the story of Operation Vengeance. It is not a story about war in the traditional sense, armies colliding, cities burning, nations rising and falling. It is a story about precision, about the moment when intelligence becomes weapon, when information becomes justice, when 16 men in aluminum fighters cross 400 miles of ocean to kill one man because mathematics told them exactly where he would be. It is a story about revenge. Cold and calculated, delivered at 400 miles per hour. To understand April 18th, 1943, you must first understand December 7th, 1941. That morning, the Hawaiian sun rose over Pearl Harbor the way it had risen 1,000 times before, indifferent, beautiful, illuminating a harbor full of battleships that represented the steel backbone of American naval power in the Pacific. The USS Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, California, Nevada, Tennessee, Maryland, Pennsylvania, names that sounded like geography lessons, ships that looked like floating fortresses. Men ate breakfast, wrote letters, complained about the heat. The war in Europe seemed distant. The Pacific seemed safe. At 07:48, the first Japanese aircraft arrived. They came in waves, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, 183 aircraft in the first wave alone, followed by 171 more. They carried torpedoes, specially modified with wooden fins, to run shallow in Pearl Harbor's 40-foot deep waters. They carried armor-piercing bombs converted from 16-inch naval shells. They carried orders signed by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had spent years studying in America, who spoke English, who understood American culture better than most of his colleagues, and who believed that the only way Japan could win a war against the United States was to cripple its Pacific Fleet in a single, devastating blow. The attack lasted less than 2 hours. When it ended, 2,403 Americans were dead. 4 battleships had been sunk. 4 more were damaged. The Arizona remained on the harbor floor, entombed with 177 sailors. The oil still leaking from her ruptured hull would create rainbows on the water for decades. Yamamoto's gamble had worked. Tactically, the Pacific Fleet had been mauled, but the Admiral knew something his colleagues did not, something that kept him awake at night. He knew that the American aircraft carriers, the Enterprise, Lexington, and Saratoga, had not been in port. He knew that America's industrial capacity dwarfed Japan's. He knew that the attack, rather than breaking American will, had awakened something far more dangerous. American anger. "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve," he reportedly said. Though the quote's authenticity remains debated, whether he said it or not, he believed it. Yamamoto understood that Japan had perhaps a year to consolidate its gains before the giant fully woke. After that, the mathematics of production, ships, planes, weapons, men, would doom Japan to defeat. By April 1943, that year had passed. The Americans had not broken. Instead, they had learned. At Midway, they had destroyed 4 Japanese carriers and turned the tide of the war. At Guadalcanal, they had proven they could fight and win a grinding campaign of attrition. The sleeping giant was not only awake, it was advancing island by island, mile by mile, bringing with it a fury born from the fires of Pearl Harbor. And now, in a basement at Arlington Hall in Virginia, American code breakers had given the giant a gift, the exact itinerary of Admiral Yamamoto's upcoming inspection tour of forward bases in the Solomon Islands. The message had been intercepted on April 13th, 1943. It was coded in JN-25, the Japanese Navy's operational cipher, which American cryptanalysts had been breaking with increasing success since before the war. The decrypt revealed that on April 18th, Admiral Yamamoto would depart Rabaul at 600 hours, flying in a Mitsubishi G4M bomber escorted by 6 Zero fighters. He would arrive at Balal Airfield on Bougainville at 9:45. The message included his complete flight path, his departure time, his arrival time, even the number of escorts. It was intelligence so precise that it seemed like a trap, but the code breakers were certain. They had been reading Japanese naval communications for months, piecing together fragments of information, building a picture of enemy movements that became clearer with each decoded message. This was real. Yamamoto, the man who had planned Pearl Harbor, would be in the air on April 18th, following a route that could be calculated, anticipated, intercepted. The message went up the chain of command, from Arlington Hall to Naval Intelligence, from Naval Intelligence to Admiral Chester Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. Nimitz understood what he was holding, an opportunity to kill the architect of Pearl Harbor, to decapitate Japanese naval leadership, to deliver a blow not just to Japan's military capability, but to its morale. But the decision was not his alone. This was an assassination, targeted and premeditated. It required authorization from the highest level. The message was sent to Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox, who brought it to President Franklin Roosevelt. Roosevelt's authorization was immediate and unambiguous. Get Yamamoto. The order carried risks. If the mission succeeded, the Japanese might realize their codes had been broken, forcing them to change their cipher systems and blinding American intelligence. But Roosevelt and his advisors calculated that the value of killing Yamamoto outweighed the risk. The man who planned Pearl Harbor would die, not in combat, not in a fair fight, but in a precisely executed ambush made possible by mathematics. It was justice. American-style, efficient, calculated, delivered with overwhelming force. At Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, Major John Mitchell received the mission briefing on April 17th. He was the operations officer of the 339th Fighter Squadron, part of the 347th Fighter Group, flying P-38 Lightnings, twin-engine, twin-boom fighters with the range and speed to reach Bougainville and back, a round trip of over 800 miles. Mitchell was not told who the target was, only that a high-ranking officer would be flying a specific route at a specific time, and that intercepting him was of utmost importance. 16 P-38s would fly the mission. Mitchell would lead. The plan was simple in concept, brutally difficult in execution. Fly 400 miles at wave-top altitude to avoid radar detection. Arrive at the interception point at exactly 0935 hours, not a minute early. Not a minute late, climb to attack altitude and destroy the bombers before the Zeros could interfere. Everything depended on timing. Navigation over open ocean with 1940s technology meant dead reckoning. Compass headings, airspeed, wind corrections, calculations done by hand on knee pads. A 1-degree error in heading, sustained over 400 miles, would put them dozens of miles off course. They would miss the interception. Yamamoto would live. The mission would fail. Mitchell spent the night of April 17th reviewing the flight plan. Departure at 0725. Fly west-northwest at 200 feet above the water. Radio silence. Fuel would be critical. The P-38s would be flying at the edge of their range. If they encountered headwinds, if they had to dogfight the Zeros for too long, they might not have enough fuel to return. They would have to ditch in the ocean, hundreds of miles from friendly territory, and hope for rescue. At dawn on April 18th, Mitchell's 16 fighters lined up on Henderson Field's Marston Mat runway. Engines roaring, propellers slicing humid air. The pilots knew this mission was different, though most didn't know why. They had been told only that success was essential, that failure was unacceptable, that they were flying into history. At 0725, Mitchell's P-38 rolled forward, lifted off, and turned northwest. 15 others followed. They descended to 200 feet and began the long, tense journey across the Solomon Sea. In the cockpit of his P-38, Captain Thomas Lanphier tried not to think about fuel. He tried not to think about navigation errors. He tried not to think about the fact that they were flying a mission based on intercepted enemy communications, which meant the enemy might know they were coming. Instead, he focused on the sound of his engines, the vibration of the airframe, the endless blue below. Lanphier was 24 years old. He had been flying fighters since before Pearl Harbor, had seen combat over Guadalcanal, had learned the hard lessons of aerial warfare. Speed is life, altitude is life insurance, hesitation is death. He knew the P-38 intimately, its strengths, its limitations, the way it handled in a dive, the way its twin engines could pull you out of situations that would kill a pilot in a single-engine fighter. But this mission was different. This wasn't a patrol or a bomber escort or even a dogfight. This was an execution. They were flying 400 miles to kill someone specific, someone important enough that headquarters had risked 16 fighters and pilots on the chance of success. At 0934, after more than 2 hours of low-altitude flight, Mitchell's navigation proved flawless. Ahead, exactly where the flight plan said they would be, 2 bombers and 6 Zeros appeared against the jungle backdrop. Mitchell's voice crackled over the radio, calm and precise. Bogies. 11 o'clock. The 16 P-38s split into 2 groups. Mitchell led 12 as cover, tasked with engaging the Zero escorts. Lanphier, along with Lieutenant Rex Barber, Lieutenant Besby Holmes, and Lieutenant Ray Hine, would go for the bombers. The plan required perfect coordination. The killer flight had to reach the bombers before the Zeros could intervene. Lanphier pushed his throttle forward and climbed. The bombers were low, perhaps 500 feet above the jungle, flying straight and level. The Zeros had seen the P-38s and were turning to intercept, dropping their external fuel tanks, preparing to defend. But they were too far, too slow. The Americans had surprise and speed. Lanphier focused on the lead bomber. He could see it growing larger in his windscreen, could see the green and brown camouflage pattern, could see sunlight glinting off the cockpit glass. At 400 yards, he pressed the trigger. 4 50-caliber machine guns and 1 20-millimeter cannon opened fire. The P-38 shuddered. Tracers arced across the sky. The bomber's right engine exploded. Fire bloomed orange and black. The aircraft began to roll, nose dropping, unable to maintain altitude. Lanphier flew past, banking hard to avoid collision, and watched as the bomber plunged into the jungle canopy and disappeared in a fireball. Behind him, Rex Barber engaged the second bomber, raking it with gunfire until it too began smoking and losing altitude. It crashed into the water off the coast, cartwheeling across the waves before sinking. The entire engagement lasted less than 2 minutes. In the lead bomber, the Shu, one Lanfear had shot down, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, sat in the passenger compartment as the airframe shuddered under the impact of American bullets. There was no time to think, no time to react. The engine exploded. The aircraft rolled. The jungle rushed up. Search parties would find the wreckage the next day. They would find Yamamoto's body still strapped into his seat, thrown clear of the fuselage, sitting upright beneath a tree as if merely resting. He had been shot twice, once in the back of the head, once through the shoulder. Whether he died from the crash or from the bullets would never be conclusively determined. It did not matter. He was dead. In his pocket they found his personal effects, a watch, a diary, a calligraphy brush. The watch had stopped at 0945, the exact time of the ambush, the exact time predicted by American intelligence 5 days earlier. The news of Yamamoto's death was not immediately released. The Japanese Navy, stunned and humiliated, kept it secret for over a month, unsure how to explain that their most brilliant strategist had been killed in an ambush made possible by broken codes and precise intelligence. When the announcement finally came on May 23, 1943, it was framed as death in combat, a heroic sacrifice. A state funeral was held. Yamamoto was posthumously promoted to Fleet Admiral. The Emperor himself mourned. But within Japanese naval circles, the truth was understood. They had been outmaneuvered, not in battle but in intelligence. The Americans had known exactly where Yamamoto would be, exactly when he would be there, and had executed an operation so precise that it seemed almost surgical. The psychological impact was devastating. If Yamamoto, careful, cautious Yamamoto, could be killed in an ambush, then no one was safe. The Americans were not merely stronger, they were smarter. For the Americans, the news was released gradually, carefully. On May 21st, Major John Mitchell and Captain Thomas Lanfear were awarded the Navy Cross. The mission was described in vague terms, a highly successful combat operation, without mentioning Yamamoto by name. It was only after the war that the full details emerged. The code-breaking, the presidential authorization, the navigation, the interception. Captain Lanfear would spend the rest of his life claiming credit for the kill, insisting that his bullets had brought down Yamamoto's bomber. Lieutenant Rex Barber would contest this, presenting evidence that he, not Lanfear, had fired the fatal shots. The dispute would never be fully resolved. Both men would die claiming credit. In the end, it did not matter. Yamamoto was dead. The mission had succeeded. One name on a casualty list had changed the course of the Pacific War, but there was something else, something that transcended the specifics of who fired which shots. Operation Vengeance represented a new kind of warfare, one where information was as deadly as explosives, where mathematics could kill as surely as bullets. The interception was possible only because American cryptanalysts had broken Japanese naval codes. The mission succeeded because American planners could coordinate across thousands of miles, calculating fuel consumption, airspeed, wind drift, interception points. The kill was achieved because American pilots, flying American-designed aircraft powered by American engines, executed a plan that required perfect timing and perfect navigation across 400 miles of ocean. This was not Bushido. This was not warrior spirit. This was industrial precision applied to assassination. The Japanese had expected that their cultural emphasis on honor and courage would give them an advantage in war. They believed that American soldiers, raised in comfort, would lack the discipline to endure hardship. What they discovered instead was that Americans didn't need to endure hardship. They could systematically eliminate it. They could break codes, track movements, calculate trajectories. They could turn war into a science. In the months after Yamamoto's death, Japanese morale began to fracture. Officers who had once spoken confidently about ultimate victory now spoke in whispers about survival. The myth of Japanese invincibility, already damaged at Midway and Guadalcanal, crumbled further. If the Americans could reach out and kill the man who planned Pearl Harbor, what else could they do? There is a sound that haunted Japanese pilots in the South Pacific after April 1943, a sound that became associated with American air superiority. It was the roar of the P-38 Lightning's twin Allison engines, a distinctive, asymmetric rumble that could be heard from miles away. The Japanese called the P-38 two planes, one pilot because of its twin-boom design. They learned to fear it because it was fast, heavily armed, and had the range to appear anywhere, anytime. After Yamamoto's death, that sound took on new meaning. It became a reminder that the Americans could not only outproduce Japan, they could outthink it. Every time Japanese pilots heard the distinctive roar of P-38 engines, they remembered that their greatest admiral had heard that same sound in the last seconds of his life. The P-38 became a symbol, not just of American air power, but of American methodology. It was designed by engineers at Lockheed, built in factories in California, powered by engines from General Motors, flown by pilots trained in standardized programs across dozens of bases. It was not a weapon born from tradition or warrior culture. It was a weapon born from assembly lines and blueprints and the systematic application of industrial capacity to military problems. When Thomas Lanphier pulled the trigger and sent Yamamoto's bomber into the jungle, he was not merely killing a man. He was demonstrating that America's strength lay not in its warriors, but in its systems, its ability to gather information, process it, and act on it with speed and precision. In the wreckage of Yamamoto's bomber, well, the day after the crash, Japanese search parties discovered his personal diary. The entries from the weeks before his death painted a portrait of a man who understood, perhaps better than anyone in Japan, that the war was already lost. He wrote about dwindling resources, about the impossibility of replacing trained pilots, about the growing strength of American forces. He wrote about Pearl Harbor, not with pride, but with something closer to regret. One entry, dated April 10, 1943, 8 days before his death, contained a line that Japanese historians would debate for decades. The situation is more serious than at any time since the war began. We must prepare for what cannot be avoided. What could not be avoided was defeat. What could not be avoided was the mathematical certainty that a nation of 70 million could not defeat a nation of 130 million, especially when that larger nation had more steel, more oil, more factories, more of everything that modern war required. Yamamoto had known this before Pearl Harbor. He had argued against war with the United States. When overruled, he had done his duty, planning and executing the attack that he believed was Japan's only chance. And when that attack failed to achieve its strategic objective, the destruction of American will, he had known that everything that followed was merely a countdown to surrender. The Americans who killed him did not know about the diary. They did not know that they were executing a man who had, in some sense, been on their side, who had warned against the war, who had studied in America, who had understood that this conflict would end in Japan's ruin. They knew only that he had planned Pearl Harbor, that he bore responsibility for the deaths of thousands, and that justice, cold and calculated, required his death. After the war, Thomas Lanphier would be asked over and over what it felt like to kill Yamamoto. He gave different answers at different times. Sometimes he spoke of satisfaction, of a mission accomplished. Sometimes he spoke of the mechanical aspects, airspeed, deflection, trigger pressure, but in a 1965 interview, late in his life, he gave a different answer. "I didn't feel anything in the moment," he said. "You're too focused on flying, on shooting, on not getting killed yourself." It's only later, when you're back on the ground, when you have time to think, that you realize you've killed someone important. And then you start wondering about who he was. Whether he had a family, whether he believed in what he was doing. But in war, those questions don't matter. You do what you're told. You complete the mission, and you hope it means something. It did mean something. But perhaps not what anyone expected. The strategic impact of Yamamoto's death has been debated by historians for decades. Some argue that it was decisive, that removing Japan's most capable naval strategist crippled their ability to respond to American advances. Others argue that by April 1943, Japan's fate was already sealed, that Yamamoto's death merely accelerated the inevitable. Both views have merit. What is undeniable is the psychological impact on both sides. For the Japanese, Yamamoto's death was a symbol of vulnerability. If the Americans could kill him, no one was safe. The myth of the impregnable defensive perimeter collapsed. Officers began to suspect that their communications were compromised, that the enemy knew more than they should. Trust eroded. Morale declined. The warrior spirit that had sustained them through the early victories could not compensate for the growing awareness that they were being systematically hunted. For the Americans, Yamamoto's death was vindication. Pearl Harbor had been avenged, not in a grand fleet battle, but in a precise surgical strike that demonstrated American superiority in intelligence, logistics, and execution. The mission became a model for future operations. Identify the target, gather intelligence, plan meticulously, execute flawlessly. It was war as engineering problem, and the Americans were the best engineers. There is a photograph of Henderson Field taken in May 1943, a few weeks after Operation Vengeance. It shows rows of P-38 Lightnings parked on the Marston Mat runway, propellers still, pilots standing in the shade beneath the wings. The image is unremarkable, just another snapshot from the Pacific War, one of thousands. But look closely at one of the fighters, third from the left. On its nose, someone has painted 16 small Japanese flags, each representing a confirmed kill. One of those flags is larger than the others. Beneath it, in white paint, is a single character. Shan, the first character of Yamamoto's name. That photograph was classified until 1946. The military did not want to reveal the extent to which American intelligence had penetrated Japanese communications. But after the war, when the full story emerged, that image became iconic. It represented not just a successful mission, but a transformation in warfare, the moment when intelligence and precision became as important as firepower and numbers. By 1944, the Pacific War had become a grinding advance across islands and atolls, each one a smaller, bloodier echo of the last. The Japanese fought with desperate courage, knowing they could not win, but refusing to surrender. The Americans fought with mechanical efficiency, knowing that victory was inevitable, but impatient to achieve it. The casualties mounted on both sides, but the trajectory was clear, and in every Japanese naval headquarters, in every command post from Rabaul to Tokyo, officers knew that their communications were compromised. They changed codes, implemented new security protocols, operated under the assumption that everything they transmitted was being read by American cryptanalysts. Some of this was true, some was paranoia, but the paranoia itself was debilitating. Trust dissolved, coordination suffered. The Japanese Navy, once a cohesive force, fragmented into isolated units acting on outdated information and fear. This, too, was a legacy of Operation Vengeance. The death of one man had not merely removed a strategic mind, it had shattered the illusion of security. The Japanese had believed their codes were unbreakable. Yamamoto's death proved otherwise, and that knowledge, that awareness of vulnerability, was as damaging as any battlefield defeat. In 1945, when the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, some Japanese officers reportedly said that they finally understood what Yamamoto had known all along, that America's strength was not merely military, but existential. The atomic bomb was not just a weapon, it was a statement. It was proof that the United States could mobilize resources on a scale that Japan could not comprehend, could innovate technologies that seemed impossible, could deliver destruction with precision and overwhelming force. Operation Vengeance had been a preview. A single mission, executed with mathematical precision, demonstrating that American power lay in systems, not individuals. The atomic bombs were the culmination, a weapon born from factories, laboratories, mines, universities, all coordinated by a system so vast and complex that no single person understood it entirely. Yamamoto had feared this. He had tried to warn his colleagues, and when they did not listen, he had done his duty, knowing it would end in defeat. His death, orchestrated by the very systems he had warned about, was both ironic and inevitable. There is a grave in Tokyo, in the Tama Cemetery, where Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto is buried. It's a simple stone, unremarkable, visited mostly by historians and elderly veterans who remember the war. Fresh flowers are placed there occasionally, though fewer each year as the generation that knew him passes. On April 18th each year, the anniversary of his death, a small group gathers at the grave. They do not speak, they bow, they pray, they leave. It is a ritual of remembrance, not celebration, because even in Japan, even among those who honor Yamamoto's memory, there is an understanding that his death was not tragic in the classical sense. It was logical. It was the natural consequence of a war Japan should never have started, fought with weapons Japan could not match, against an enemy Japan could not defeat. Yamamoto knew this. He had tried to prevent the war. When ordered to fight it, he had done so with brilliance and courage. And when his time came, he faced it the way warriors are supposed to face death, calmly, without complaint, accepting what could not be avoided. The Americans who killed him would say years later that they respected him, that they understood. He was a man of honor, doing his duty in a dishonorable cause. But respect does not prevent bullets. It does not spare lives. In war, respect is a luxury reserved for peacetime. The P-38 Lightning that Thomas Lanphier flew on April 18, 1943, was eventually retired from service. After the war, it was scheduled to be scrapped, melted down for aluminum, recycled into civilian aircraft or cookware or car parts. But someone, a mechanic perhaps, or a historian, recognized the aircraft's significance and arranged for it to be preserved. It was repainted in its original camouflage scheme, restored to flying condition, and placed in a museum. Today, that P-38 sits in a hangar in California, one of dozens of warbirds, maintained by enthusiasts and historians who believe that these machines should not be forgotten. Children walk past it, unaware of what it represents. Veterans stop, stare, remember. Occasionally, on special anniversaries, the aircraft is rolled out, engines started, and flown in formation with other survivors from the war. When it flies, it makes the same sound, that distinctive asymmetric roar that Japanese pilots learned to fear. It is a sound that has outlived the men who flew it, outlived the men who feared it, outlived the war itself. It is a sound that represents not just air power, but the systematic application of industrial capacity to military objectives. It is the sound of American vengeance, delivered at 400 miles per hour. In the end, Operation Vengeance was not about Yamamoto. It was about systems, about the superiority of coordinated intelligence, precision planning, and overwhelming execution. It was about proving that democracy, for all its inefficiencies and complexities, could mobilize resources and intelligence in ways that authoritarian regimes could not match. Yamamoto had understood this. He had studied in America, had seen the factories, the highways, the culture of innovation and production. He had warned his superiors that attacking such a nation was suicide. They had not listened, and so he had done his duty, knowing it would end in failure, hoping only to delay the inevitable long enough for a negotiated peace. There would be no negotiated peace. There would be only total war, fought with every weapon, every resource, every ounce of industrial capacity that the United States could bring to bear. And when the war ended, it would not end with treaties and compromises. It would end with surrender, absolute and unconditional. Yamamoto did not live to see it. He died in the jungle, shot from the sky by pilots flying aircraft designed in California, guided by intelligence gathered in Virginia, authorized by a president in Washington. He died knowing that his warnings had been ignored, his strategies had failed, his nation was doomed. He died hearing the sound of P-38 engines, the sound of American efficiency, American abundance, American vengeance. April 18th, 1943, 09:35 hours. The sky above Bougainville, the air at 20,000 feet is thin and cold. Below, the Solomon Sea stretches in every direction, endless, indifferent, the same blue that has swallowed so many men without ceremony or memory. A bomber falls from the sky, trailing smoke, breaking apart as it meets the jungle. A man dies, still strapped in his seat beneath a tree. His watch stopped at the exact moment predicted by mathematics 5 days earlier. And in the cockpits of 16 P-38 Lightnings, young men from Kansas and California, from Alabama and New York turn for home, their fuel gauges hovering near empty, their mission complete. They do not know that they have changed the war. They do not know that the man they killed had warned against this conflict, had understood its inevitable outcome, had tried to prevent it. They know only that they have done their duty, that they have avenged Pearl Harbor, that justice, cold, calculated, mathematical, has been delivered. They fly east toward Henderson Field, toward debriefings and medals and a place in history. Behind them, the jungle burns, the ocean churns, the war continues, island by island, mile by mile, moving inexorably toward a conclusion that was decided. Not on battlefields, but in factories, laboratories, and the minds of codebreakers who turn secrets into weapons. This is the truth of modern war. It is not won by warriors, but by systems, not by courage, but by capacity, not by spirit, but by steel. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto knew this truth. He lived with it, fought against it, and died because of it. And the sound of his death, the roar of twin Allison engines, the chatter of 50 caliber guns, the explosion of a bomber meeting jungle, is the sound of history turning, of one era ending and another beginning, of vengeance delivered not in rage, but in the cold, precise mathematics of American industrial power. The sky remembers nothing. The ocean forgets everything, but the sound remains, echoing across the decades, a reminder that some debts are paid in full, with interest calculated to the second.